Well, hello everybody. It's October 9th, 2023, and we just released Action Talks episode 29 with Ken O'Hara, and I've got quite a few others in the bank right now. And I expect that I'll actually have 52 episodes, 50 probably, but could probably just put it up at 52, one per week for the first year. And it's kind of crazy to think that I've been doing this for almost a year now, because my first interview was about a year ago with Kenji Tanigaki. He was the first one I interviewed. That's probably why that interview was one of the rougher ones for me. A lot of my questions were very leading. I was trying to sometimes I had an idea of what I wanted him to say, and I realized through that conversation that I should just let him talk, And that was my that was my he was so nice, and being my first interview, he was extremely nice. So thank you, Kenji, for being my first victim. Uh, and then even though I didn't release him until episode 6, um, and then Scott Adkins was number 3, right? And that was probably, it was one of my biggest episodes yet. It's the most viewed episode so far. And I mean, he's an amazing guest, obviously. I edited that one myself. That was one of the, I think Kenji was the last one I edited. No, excuse me, Ron Gilbert was the last one I edited on my own. Then after that, and actually ever since doing, I think Stan Hom, even I had Phil edit that one. I've just had other people doing the edits. I've been paying editors to take a crack at it, which has been very successful. They've all been amazing. So, a lot of folks. One of them's here right now in the chat, Patrick, and so we've got some really exciting ones coming up. I think that if I were to kind of grade Action Talks right now, first of all, you could look at a podcast in a couple different ways, because I've done about 45, almost 50 interviews now. So again, we've got like 10 or 20 in the bank that are being edited right now. Koichi is done. Koichi is edited, by the way, Cyclone. So that's an awesome one. But there are various ways that you can judge a podcast. One is just raw view count, and on this metric, Action Talks is not doing that well. Action Talks gets between 1 and 3,000 views per episode. And I mean, I think that in context of just like average podcasts, that's probably pretty normal. But I have 187,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. So I would have thought that there would be a significant uptick in viewership, and there hasn't been. There's actually been a declining viewership. So if you were to only look at it in terms of viewing metrics, it's not a success. However, I think there are lots of other ways of looking at a podcast. First of all, is the quality of interviews. Not that I'm talking about my quality of interviewing, but the actual quality of the guests is very good. Even guests who are not very well known, they give information that I think is not very common. You don't really see game animators talking about their method. You don't really see people talking about violence and parenthood in the action industry. So I think at least, it offers that. It offers an interesting perspective. And we have a nice variety of guests. So I think on that front, the diversity of the people that we're talking to on Action Talks, the quality of the edits also is very high. Again, thanks to the editors. They've been very consistent with all the edits. There's a style sheet that they follow. So I think overall, after episode 52, I'm just going to go ahead and put it at 52 for season 1. We'll see how we can make season 2 significantly better. And I think that there are a lot of ways of doing this. First of all, is probably getting me a better microphone, getting me better lighting, maybe a better background. I don't know if people like this. This is my office. This is where I work. This is where I do podcasts. I mean, I could do it with martial arts supplies in the background, but it's not really what the podcast is about, right? Like, it's not about just martial arts and stunts. It's about how people think. So I want to keep that. I want to keep the more philosophical approach. and I would like to do more of the interviews in person. Now, I'll be upfront about what it costs to do a podcast. Um, you could do a podcast for free, and that would probably mean, you do your interview, you don't spend much time editing it, because if as soon as you start getting into splicing in video footage and all the reference material and whatnot, then you start running into, between 8 and probably 40 hours of editing time. I think Ron Gilbert's took me probably 20 hours to edit. It's a lot of time. And that's not free. Your time's not free. I mean, kind of is, but you have opportunity costs associated with that. And at some point, if you want to do this weekly, that's a huge burden. So try doing between 15 and 30 hours of editing per week to release one episode that only gets 1 to 2,000 views, and you realize that this is not a cheap endeavor, right? But all that's to say, I plan on continuing after season one. So I want to maintain that, and so in terms of the cost again, so for editing, it's between like $200 and $500 to edit an episode, and that's not good pay, frankly. I mean, that's just not. It's not great pay, but it's all I can afford because I don't even make that much in ad revenue, right? I don't even get close to that much, so it's not even paying for itself yet. Uh, if you were to do in-person interviews, then you now have to factor in travel, accommodation, feeding your guest. Now you're talking about like $1,000 per episode. So in order to get that, and also if your guest doesn't charge you, right? Your guest might charge you a speaker fee. So if you get a really high caliber guest, they might charge you, maybe $1,000 speaker fee. You never know. Because in person, it's just generally higher quality. And the reason I want to do in-person interviews is because it's much easier to have a conversation in person. And over Zoom, there are strategies that you can adopt to try and get a word in edgewise when your guest is, perhaps your guest sometimes might go a little bit off topic. You want to bring it back on topic. That's really difficult in Zoom. So you have to come up with some kind of cue system so that they know that you want them to come back on topic, or that you want that they need to know to let you speak up, right? So in person would be much higher quality, but the cost is very high. I mean, you're talking about like 5 times as much money. You also have to edit the trailer. You got to make the thumbnail. You got to schedule the uploads. You have to have it becomes very time consuming. So these are things that we've sort of worked out in season one. I'm excited to work them out so that season two is even better. So even if only a few of them are in person, I think that's a bump. And we've got 1 or 2 coming up that are going to be in person here at the studio. So I'm really excited about those. Take some questions real quick. Let's see. Gadali. Hey, Gadali. So many great interviews so far, yours included, man. Thanks for being a part of it. Prince, Akira Koeyama would be great. I don't know who that is, Prince. You'll have to tell me. Let's see. Cyclone says, interview with Kenji was my favorite. He talks about the difference of Hong Kong and Japanese action in general. Okay. So that's been the most interesting part of doing action talks for me. That's been one of in terms of the value of it, I think that's been the most valuable aspect, is just the, what would you say? I mean, it's the research that it provides. Because the original reason I started doing action talks was not to do a podcast. I actually was doing it for a research project, for a book I'm writing. It's called The Art of Violence, and I'm going to give you an update on that afterward as well. But the research that, the episodes turned into podcast episodes, and it just made sense at a certain point. But the things that I've been able to take away from it have made it totally worthwhile, because after interviewing guys like Kenji, I've interviewed Koichi Sakamoto. I interviewed Osamu Kaneda from Japan Action Club, Japan Action Enterprise. Directed a bunch of the Kamen Rider films. Ken Ohara, all these, Japanese stunt guys, because I just didn't really know anything about the Japanese stunt industry. I knew it at a surface level, but I didn't get it. I didn't know the history of it. Ruben Langdon, uh, Johnny Young Bosch, obviously, there's a lot of overlap. There's a ton of overlap with Japanese action coming into America, and we don't really see it. We don't really see the influence. And over the course of all of these episodes, you can kind of piece together something like a family tree of Japanese action. And, one of the most interesting things about Japanese action is that there are essentially two schools of thought in Japanese action. And please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but from what I've found, there are two strands. One comes from the Toei studio, which is the home of Chambara films, Zatoichi, um, all the big samurai films, Akira Kurosawa films, right? That's the Toei model, Toei, Toei. And the Toei model is very star-centered. You have a star in the center, and then there's a bunch of guys around the star, right? And all those stunt guys, there's a name for them. I forgot what it was. Ruben mentioned what that word is. Those guys are all great actors, and they're stuntmen. And their job is to be in the periphery of the fight. And if you pause a Chambara film on any frame, and you look at any one of those stunt guys, they're all fantastic. Every one of those guys can act. They can act the balls off of any stunt background guy that we know. They're fantastic because that's what they're trained in. They're trained to be background performers. And this is all part and parcel to a very specific shooting style that Toei used, which is very star-centered, and that means that the star is in the center, and he stays in the center, or she stays in the center, right? And if the star moves this way, the camera pans, right? The camera's going to pan with the star no matter where they go. Okay, the star might run off camera at some point, but by and large, that star is in the center. And there's even the Kamen Rider stuntman who became the star of the show. Can't remember his name, but he gave a course on how to run, how to take off running as Kamen Rider using the Toei model, which is that you don't dip down before you run because then you're going to force the camera operator to tilt down. You can't do that. You don't do that. You don't tilt down. The camera doesn't follow the actor. The actor has to stand upright and go forward, right? There's a certain posing style associated with that. And then when the star hits a stunt performer, the camera does not follow the stunt performer. Okay, the stunt is choreographed so that it's either on camera or the stunt just goes off camera. And they just allow that because that's just how it's shot. And you'll notice that Jackie Chan kind of shoots that way, right? If Jackie's going to have a stunt guy fall, he might do a special, but more than likely he'll maintain the center of the frame. He'll maintain the center of the frame, and the stunt guy will fall, and he won't force the camera to pan down. He'll just kind of make the camera in such a position so that it's already going to see the stuntman fall. It's very John Wick in that sense. So that's the Toei model. Then there's the Karate Action Club, the Karate promotion model, which follows the stuntman. And Karate, he's the great Japanese action star in Hong Kong. Was a star in various Hong Kong films, and he was he was part of Japan Action Club. Now, going back, Japan Action Club adopted the Toei model because Japan Action Club was the action club of the Toei studio. And they were huge. They had hundreds of members. And so Karate was part of Japan Action Club. A lot of Japan Action Club is also a lot of the Toei model. It's sort of predicated on kabuki theater, where you have very specific lines of attack for, like, if you do a sword attack, they call it mai. You have top, bottom, left, right. I'm mirrored right now. I'm kind of confused. Diagonal, 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 and then forward. And there are certain responses to each one of those. There's this block, there's this block, there's this block. And it's all kind of safe distancing in the kabuki style of theater. And that's a very specific aesthetic. It allows a very nice shape. It looks very traditional. And it allows for Like what they'll do is they'll clash swords here, and then they'll bring it down, right? And then the question was always, well, why don't you just clash here? It would be so much more dangerous. But it's like, well, the point is to make a nice shape here and then bring it down, right? And then make the drama. So it's about posing. It's not really about realism, even though the kabuki style of combat was like in the same sort of generation time period as like actual Ronin and samurai were out there fighting, right? So it's not that far separated, uh, just spiritually, I guess you could say, from actual warfare. Okay, so Kurata's part of Japan Action Club. You can see him in some of Sonny Chiba's early films. And then Kurata says, "Well, this is just not realistic. This is a guy who's I think he's Goju Ryu. I can't remember. But his big thing was like, let's make it look more dangerous. Let's make the attacks look like they're close. And that's what he really liked about the Hong Kong cinema is they would close the gap. Things were faster. And so, and in Hong Kong cinema, they follow the stuntman down. That was just like part of the package. And he brought that back to Japan, started karate promotion, and you have this very different kind of action style with karate school. And his students were Tetsuo, and you had Kenji, and of course, sorry, my names right now are escaping me. Um, Koichi Sakamoto. And you watch all their films, they follow the stunt guy down, right? So for them, it's about impact. It's about selling big gags. It's about selling pain. It's not about selling poses as much. Um, that would be the Toei model. So you can kind of see there that like the Japanese action style, that if you start at the top, if you start at the beginning with like real samurai combat, right, and then that just goes right down into kabuki, and kabuki is just sort of like kayfabe version of actual samurai combat, right? And kabuki goes into live shows, and that goes to the Toei model, Japan Action Club, and it's pretty continuous or contiguous all the way down the line until through the 70s. All the Sentai stuff was shot same style, and then karate influenced by Hong Kong, so the Hong Kong influence comes in and it makes two different schools in Japan, and those two schools are basically what you have today in Japan. And that's fascinating, I think. And that's just Japan. So then you look at Hong Kong, you look at Korea. Like, why does Korean action look the way that it does, right? And these are all things that I'm trying to explore with Action Talks. And not many people have put together family trees. Now, Kenji did do a family tree of the Japanese action styles. It's fantastic. And I got a translation of it done, and I'll post it again. I think I posted it on my feed on YouTube. And you can see where all of the main Japanese action teams came from originally. So what I want to continue doing with Action Talks is kind of probing the origins of Korean action, right? Like, a few recent guests I talked to, like I don't want to spoil anything, but a few guests recently were talking about how Korean stunt guys coming into Hong Kong, how hardcore they were, and how they were just willing to do whatever they had to do to take a hit. And there's kind of an interesting, and when they would do that, and then they would go back to Korea in the 90s, they didn't like do the Hong Kong thing when they went back to Korea. They kind of did this mix of like Japanese and Hong Kong, and then I think that you then have a mix of American, Japanese, and Hong Kong, and that's how you get something like Shiri and City of Violence and all these. So there's like a very kind of like American sentiment to it because it's so character based. But anyway, the Korean stuff is all stuff that I'm really interested in. I know nothing about it still. I think that I'm still a total noob here. So that's the big stuff I want to figure out with Action Talks is how to build that family tree. Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, India. I want to get all of it. I think it'd be great to have a little family tree. It's gonna be big, a big little family tree that connects it all. And take some more questions here real quick. Let's see here. Outrigger, will we ever get Rope It Up 3? I would love to do that. It's just difficult to do a short film. It's really hard. I would love to. Do I like pro wrestling? I've never really watched pro wrestling. I don't know. I think I liked it as a kid more. I think now I like pro wrestling just because I think studying kayfabe is really interesting. Um, but sometimes I think that you can, I think that some of the stunts in pro wrestling are amazing, but I haven't followed the storylines enough, so I don't think I get it. I don't think I've never quite been able to follow the drama of pro wrestling. So it's a little above my head, a little over my head. Uh, okay, Dylan is asking, I love the show. I was curious about the costs relating to mocap stuff you've done. Case by case is pretty different, I'm guessing. Mocap costs, yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna give a quote for our studio, but I will say that like mainstream mocap houses, you're paying between like 25 and 50,000 a day to rent the equipment, rent the team. Then you got to cast. Casting might be another like 2,000 on top of that. Depends on how many performers you're bringing in. Mocap's expensive. Um, Dragon Guts. I'm from Brazil. I'm very excited, curious about Mars. Yeah, Mars's interview. Mars's interview was so good, but we talked about 3 movies. We talked about 3 damn movies. We could have talked about 20, but it was a slow interview because we had a translation going back and forth. Um, so he talks in detail about Dragon Lord, Police Story, Project A, and he talks all about the I love the terminology, the rescue film style action, because in the 80s these like rescue films were really popular, right? The 70s and early 80s rescue films, and how the action was very kind of like exciting and like not random, but a little bit chaotic, you know. And you look at that alley fight in Dragon Lord, and man, like I mean, he said that he and Jackie they came up with one rule in that alley fight, which was like, look, we're just gonna go all out. We just can't hit the face, and so it's just a real fight. um, and then you can see how that became Project A, and then Police Story sort of like epitomized it, where it's not so much about poses anymore. It's just about like a vector, like getting from point A to point B. Um, and then kind of merging that with Hong Kong to try and cooperate with someone who wants to go from point A to point B, because that's like the Hong Kong style, is that very cooperative, operatic, merge of 2 different performers. But when you have someone like Jackie he's just going to go, then as a performer, you have to be so good to try and like work with him as he's going from here to there, right? That's why he's so selective about who he worked with. So this is going to be a cool interview. I just need somebody who speaks Cantonese to edit it, because otherwise it's kind of tough. I'll try and get a translation done beforehand, though. So Patrick is asking, have you ever thought about hiring a social media person to promote Action Talks on Instagram? I would love if somebody promoted Action Talks on social media. Not a bad idea. There's somebody who's interested in helping out with that. I might take you up on that. Richard, good to see you, man. You lecture well. I need this for my film, Protecting Grace. Hopefully you will be in, God willing. Yeah, I've been meaning to respond to you, Richard. I will get back to you soon. Let's see. Have you ever thought about interviewing? This is from Manuel Fernandez. Have you ever thought about interviewing someone from Indian action scene? Yeah, I've interviewed 2 people from India, and I didn't quite get what. Oh, excuse me. Yes, check out Lee Whitaker's interview. He talks about India quite a bit, primarily Southern India. The the differences between Bollywood, Mollywood, and Tollywood. That's a really interesting topic. Not many people, I think, are exploring that. I think when people think of Indian action, they think that it's all just kind of one thing, and it's not. Because you have like the kind of Tollywood, super high octane, and then you have Bollywood, which is like a little bit more classical, almost wuxia, and then Mollywood, which is gritty. I mean, Mollywood movies are like lower budget and a little bit more up here. They're a little bit more Korean. Interesting stuff. I'd love to talk to people more about that. Let's see. Tomas says, you mentioned you interviewed Sonomura. Ah, yes, that one's being edited right now. And that one's cool. Because again, like that's another karate guy, right? Where his MO was making making the stunt shine and making the combat shine. And yeah, the way that he comes up with those flurries of the punches and the bobbing and weaving, which is like you're kind of taking like the flashpoint action and just you're like boiling it down to like a viscous kind of, like gelatin, right? That's kind of what his action is like. And it just starts to feel like not choreographed, which is super cool. He just gets rid of all of the glitz of Donnie Yen's choreography. Totally different in the end, you know. And he's done some mocap too. That's just fantastic. I think that guys like him really shine with mocap, especially because you can tweak things so much more easily. Um, let's see. Richard says, "Please teach how to shoot fighting. Best way to cut and stop fighting. When to move camera." See, that's all. This is all stuff that I just keep questioning myself. Like Sam Hargrave's interview is a great example, right? Like Sam's an indie stunt guy. He came up with us on the forums, making indie action films, and like dude's making $100 million movies now, right? So I'm a huge cheerleader for this guy because he's my generation. He's our Chad Stahelski, our JJ Perry, and now he works with like the biggest. He works on the biggest films in the world now. He directs the biggest films in the world, and he talked about just how he thinks when he's putting a camera into action. And the way that he does it is kind of different than the way I do it, which is that he wants the person watching it to really feel like they're there. Right? That's why he likes oneers. That's why he's always done shots like that. He's always, like the Atomic Blonde oneer, obviously the Extraction oneer from 1 and 2. And that's like a way to shoot. It's 100% a way to shoot. Because if you're in there and when something happens over there, you pan that way. Okay, that's happened. Okay, now something's happened over there, and you cue it. Like he's a good filmmaker, so he doesn't just randomly move the camera around. He cues the audience that something's happening over there, and the audience wants to look over there. Okay, I'll show you that. Oh, that's that. That's a way to shoot because as you're doing that, the audience is kind of like filling in all of this kind of intent in the scene, and you're helping the audience color the world, right? Like you're always as a viewer, you're always trying to figure out like where people are, what's coming next, like why they're doing the things that they're doing, and you kind of naturally color the stuff in based on what you see and what you hear. That's why sound design is so important. I've always stressed the importance of sound design. You can like double the amount of information by having good sound design that's not distracting, right? And the way that you do that is kind of like up for debate. Right? You could have you could do a system where you're just sort of like pointing the camera where you want people to look, and that's one way of doing it. But another way of doing it is you show a shot and you cut, and then you show a shot and you cut, and then you show this, you do this shot and you cut. And the audience can also take all that and piece together a world using that information. There's no one right way to do it, right? You look at a guy like Samo, whose editing sometimes is faster than the Bourne Identity. Look at Pedicab Driver, for example, the end fight in there. And I always cite this, and I compare that to Bourne Identity. It's about the same edit speed, right? Whereas, in Bourne Identity, the goal is to sort of like the shots are to give you emotional cues almost. And there's like some very kind of other emotional things like the pen and so like is it right or wrong to do it that way? You can't say. You can't say. It really actually depends on your personality as a filmmaker. So I love Neil Blomkamp's filmmaking style. I think he does like that kind of like war in like that kind of like war journalism style of filmmaking and action. I think he does it the best out of anybody. And I can't shoot like that. I actually wouldn't know what to do. I could fake it, but it'll be wrong. Like I wouldn't show the right stuff. So I tend to just shoot things the way that I shoot them, which is like the rope it up style, and occasionally a long take, not necessarily, but so do it the way that you think about things, the way that you piece the world together. You can take that, you can translate that into an art form, and the audience will probably follow it. Like people are they're pretty flexible as an audience. It just requires practice and trial and error. And you'll know, like you show somebody a short film and they'll be looking around on the screen, they're not going to know what happened. You'll realize that you didn't show them enough, or you'll realize that they're kind of groaning at certain jokes, or maybe they're getting bored. Well, now you're showing too much, maybe. It's difficult to say. I think that a more interesting study would be just showing how these, guests, for example, on Action Talks, how they piece action together, like how they think. Right? You could probably almost flowchart that. You could probably do like a spectrum almost, or like a grid of some kind. This guy shows a lot. This guy shows almost nothing. Right? That's my 2 cents on how to shoot action. Um, Gadali, when you're watching action, how do you study it to identify the characteristics? Watch in slow-mo, talk to people involved, open an editing app. Huh. I The first pass on watching an action scene, I I try and just get like a gut feeling of it. I'm probably going to be focused too much on little things, like I'll probably be focusing on the things I did wrong, things I don't like. I pick up very quickly. This is like a fault, and it's kind of a strength at times too. But I can tell really quickly if somebody's just kind of copied something, and that's very annoying when you just copy something but you don't have the essence of the thing that you're copying. So if somebody, does an action movie and they want to do action like The Raid, and they do raid style action, but it just doesn't have the danger of the raid, or it doesn't have the emotion, it doesn't have the acting. Well, then you've kind of missed the mark. And that's the stuff I usually notice first. It's just that kind of gut sense of, what is the inspiration behind this thing, and how did they miss? And you know, well, most people miss. So then I try and like give it its fair due. I'll go back and watch, and I'll see how they did certain shots. Try and give credit to the way that it was shot and edited, because it's never easy to shoot a fight scene. Um, I think that the action scenes that ultimately are going to do the best, for me anyway, are ones that have a good sense of danger or comedy, one or the other, and that tell a good story. Kind of a generic answer, but it's true. How often do you train? Not often enough, but I train very short bursts, with no weights really anymore, and I've managed to kind of like maintain my strength that way. When I mocap, it's 8 hours, and it feels like an 8-hour session of football. So if I do 2 of those in a week, I'm good for a week. I just don't even I don't even work out beyond that. Um, let's see. Tomaz, any thoughts on Takaguchi? Crazy Samurai Musashi is such a boring and funny movie at the same time. I think he's interesting, man. I think he's interesting because he always brings a character to what he does, and he has like he has a good posture when he fights. That's always really kind of telling when somebody has, you can fight like a stunt guy or a stunt girl, and you're the way that you move on camera is going to be very animated and very kind of wild. And some of that might come from the fact that you're just not comfortable with just standing there. And a lot of stunt guys I've seen, they can't just stand there. They can't just stand there and like, you know, just be there, right? And so guys like Talk, it's obvious that he likes just being there on camera, and he makes a lot of hay out of that. That's what I have to say about him. I think he's good. I think that I mean, you see him in a lot of things. I saw this movie about Li Shin. I can't remember the name of the movie. But it's kind of this low. It's not a very good movie, but like when he shows up, he's really good. And like he also has this thing about him where you don't quite know what he's gonna do next, and I like that. I think that's really cool. That just means that he's probably He's probably trying to avoid falling into, cliche movements. He's trying to avoid cliche trends and whatnot. And that's important, man. You got to be able to detect that stuff. If you're not able to do that, then I don't know, you become very predictable, right? And even though the audience, they can't really tell you what's predictable about your movement, but they'll intuit that there's something predictable about it. It's just the reality. Like, and you lose points. And again, they're not going to know. They're not going to know why they're kind of missing out on like an optimal cinematic experience. If you ask them afterward, they're not going to be able to say like, "Oh yeah, when he pulled out when they started fighting with swords, I just kind of had a feeling that one of them would get disarmed, and then the guy would disarm the other guy, and then they'd fight with their hands." But when that's exactly what happens in a fight, like in the Mortal Kombat finale, I know I rag on this movie, the Mortal Kombat, newer Mortal Kombat movie. I mean, that's a cliche that's like deeply embedded within the action business, and you just got to be careful of that stuff. You got to be a little bit misanthropic, I think, to see some of that stuff. And maybe talk is a jerk. I don't know, but sometimes if you want to avoid cliches, then you gotta like fight a lot of battles and you gotta stand your ground because the producer will say, well, do the Donnie Yen thing. And he'll be like, well, why would I do the Donnie Yen thing? It's not the movie for that, right? You're gonna come across as a dick, but that's not actually being a dick. Like you're just kind of trying to make something new and interesting. Okay, let's see. I'll do another question or two, and then I want to talk briefly about the book. Let's see. Johnny Sundown. I hope you get the interview with Saori. Yes, I know. I agree. From Baby Assassins. If you do get, please ask. If you do get it, please ask. How's a good way to get into Japanese stunt team nowadays? Thank you all for the hard work. Will do. Saori's awesome. I spoke with her by email. She would need an interpreter to do an interview. Um, okay, so I want to talk about the second thing now, which is my book. I'm writing a book called The Art of Violence. I've been writing about this on the YouTube channel, and it's not just a theory about violence. It is a um, it's a broader hypothesis that where I'm trying to map out what like a movement grammar might look like. So this all started when I was doing God of War, and when I would take feedback when I would do a move, right? Because you do a move in motion capture, you get 2 seconds, and then they cut. You have to do that move exactly right, and there's 12 components to this move, right? Stand in an idle, do the proper anticipation. You got to hit a pose with the anticipation, right? And there's a timing in the anticipation. You might need a double anticipation. There might be footwork before the attack, during the attack, after the attack. Then there's the hitbox. The hitbox has an angle and a silhouette, and then as you're doing that hitbox, you're going to have to throw some kind of a flavor in there. We called it Head Rage in God of War. In Demon Souls, it was just like aiming for the recovery pose. You might also do what I call the leaf spring, which is this kind of coil into the attack. So wherever the final movement of the attack comes from, you kind of coil into that, and it makes this really interesting kind of aesthetic where it looks like it's coming from somewhere else, and it just lashes out. Then you have the recovery pose that has to play to the camera perhaps sometimes, or if you're an NPC, you have to play so that you show a weak spot. You also have to make sure you stay on your feet during the recovery pose. You might have to hit a specific footwork in the recovery pose. You're also talking about a certain translation. You might need to stumble after the attack, so you have to act the footwork of the recovery pose, right? And then you got to get back to idle, and that return to idle is context dependent. If you're at the end of a fight, you might have a relaxed return to idle. If it's in the middle of a fight, you're going to want to look like you're ready for more fighting. Okay, that's like one move, right? And you get 2 seconds to do all that. Maybe less. Sometimes it's like 1 second. So, when you do a move and they say cut and they say, okay, well, that was good, except your opening idle, your feet were at 45 degrees instead of 30 degrees. Your antic, you gotta do a double antic. Make sure you hook on the recovery. Oh yeah, your hitbox should be at 45 degrees, not 30 degrees. And then you stumble a little bit on the recovery, and then when you go back to idle, make sure you get back to the original idle, right? So it's like all this feedback, and I would have the hardest time putting it all together until I just made the movement into a sentence, right? So it's just like this linear sentence. And not only is it a linear sentence, but it's also kind of predicated on who the enemy is that I'm going against, right? So I turned it into a language, and that allowed me then to take feedback, and I could like, and then I could get like 10 feedback notes, and I could put it all in one of those like pieces of the sentence, and then I could do the movement however they needed on the second take. So I could, I could get second take, and we'd get a lot of shots done in a day as a result. Okay, so like that was really useful in God of War, and I took that, went to do Demon Souls, and then when I was doing Demon Souls, I realized that they like filled those buckets up with totally different feedback. And at one point when I was doing, a movement, I came in, first thing I did was a very Kratos kind of movement for Demon Souls, and then the guy said, no, 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 you're working on a Japanese game, like it's all about the end pose, and don't make the anticipation so obvious. And I was like, why? Why is that a Japanese thing? Because I kind of see that in Chambara films too. And I got to thinking, and nobody really had a good answer. But then I got to thinking, like, well, I guess that kind of movement style is not very far from Iaido, because in Iaido you don't want to give away what you're doing. You don't want to over antic anything. So it seems like the closer your media is to its original kind of like violence in history, well, like the closer it's going to resemble actual violence, and so that grammar is going to be more similar to warfare. But if you compare something like, compare that to Hong Kong cinema or Hong Kong action is like, I don't know, 1500, 2000 years separated from real warfare. I don't know. I mean, I guess you could say that unification in China happened in like what, the Qin dynasty, 200 BC or so, 212 BC. And so like maybe Wushu is just like 2200 years worth of kind of like encoding. Oh, thanks for the donation, Zenkutsu. 2200 years of encoding from like the original warfare into like whatever it is now that you're doing in service of the state, in service of like whatever you're teaching, right? And so like when you look at Wushu, the Wushu looks nothing like warfare anymore. It's all like very symbolic as a result. And so, and compare that to American action. And American action is much more like Japanese action. Again, this is going back to the action talk stuff. It all kind of works together. American action in the stunt world anyway, these were cowboys. These cowboys probably had a lot of stories of bar fights, or at least their grandpa told them stories of bar fights in the Old West. These guys were not very far separated from the original warfare, including duels, right? So when you have kind of like and again, dueling in America, it didn't really end until like 1890. Right? There were still duels fought in the late 1800s. So from 1890 to 1920 to 1930, you still have people talking about gun duels, right? So you have experts. You would have like experts going onto studio sets and probably advising, like, no, I've seen how this works, the way that a gun duel works. The guy falls like this. The way that you shoot is this. Why would you do it like that? You're just wasting a bunch of energy, right? It would have been like much more one-to-one. And I guarantee you that's how the Toei action team originally started. Because again, you're not very far separated. But in southern China, and especially northern China, you're so far separated, especially when you're near the capital, you're so far separated from the original warfare that it's just been constantly re-encoded to kind of like retell the story of what happened, right? And you get Wushu and Wuxia. Why was I talking about this? Oh yeah. So all this is to say that like there is this kind of grammar of movement. So if there's a grammar of movement, like where the hell does that come from? Does that come from our ability to speak a language? Well, no, because I didn't have to learn Japanese to do the Japanese style movement. Ruben Langdon didn't have to learn Japanese to move like a Japanese guy. There's something actually like underneath language, right? And that's where I came up with the ROBA hypothesis, which was perhaps the original language is based in violence. Well, okay, how could that be? So the main difference between humans and animals, and I'm not going to call humans animals. I don't do this because there has to be you have to note the difference. The main difference between humans and animals, there's really two. There's two main differences. One is language, referential, recursive language. Okay. And I'm just going to quote Noam Chomsky. If you disagree with this, then you can just read Noam Chomsky's minimalist program and find out for yourself. But essentially, even if you teach a chimp sign language, well, that chimp doesn't actually learn sign language. Anyone who knows sign language, if they see a chimp doing sign language, it's kind of insulting to call it sign language. The chimp can only learn 500 signs or so, and there's not really there's not a hierarchical association between two signs. The chimp will just kind of put two signs together to just try and get whatever the chimp wants. A lot of it's based on memory and this very kind of loose association between symbols. Chimps don't have language. And if chimps are the smartest primates, then no other animal has language either. They've hypothesized that birds have language, but that's only because they have linear song and they can like change parts of the linear song structure, but linear ordering of sounds is not language, right? Because language is hierarchical. So if I say, this is the classic example, if I say birds that fly instinctively swim, birds that fly instinctively swim. Instinctively could modify fly or swim. You don't really know, right? Even though it's right next to those words. But if I put instinctively at the beginning, instinctively, birds that fly swim, then obviously instinctively modifies swim. But how can we know that? Like it's further away from the word swim now. But yet somehow we know based on English grammar that it modifies swim. And that's like very difficult for us to unravel. But it demonstrates that language is not just an assortment of words. There's some kind of mechanism underneath that orders things, right? And that's what Chomsky calls universal grammar. So if universal grammar is what births language, what linguists and anthropologists keep looking for is the moment when people first started using language. And so they look for, evidence of like a floating trachea and certain skull size, which would, allow for a lexicon and whatnot. And so they're looking for language in terms of like spoken language, um, which also ignores the fact that a lot of language is also sign language. Like sign language is a language. They found that people who have um, lesions in Broca's area, like if you get nominal aphasia, if you're unable to remember a word, for example. Can you get me that, what's it called? Yeah, the cup, that's what it was. People who have that's nominal aphasia, that affects Broca's area. Well, if you use sign language and if you have a lesion in Broca's area, you also can't sign cup, right? So all this is to say that language is not just spoken word. Language is something that's like far broader than that, right? The idea of grammar, you can put grammar to pretty much anything. So if you can put grammar to hand signals, you can put grammar, I mean, you could even put grammar to eye movement, the way that people look around as they talk, it's this kind of secondary language. If you're watching somebody talk and they're just using their hands and their eyes and you can't hear what they're saying, you can sometimes follow what they're talking about, right? And that's like a grammarization of eye movement. And so I thought, okay, well, there must be something that happened earlier that still made humans different from animals. And the thing that separates humans from animals, I believe, first is our ability to use objects for aggression. Chimps don't have this. Chimps don't use objects for aggression. Their use of objects for aggression is incidental. They use it for threats, but they don't really think, I'm going to bring a stick to this fight because like that's going to give me a reach advantage, or I'm going to bring a rock to this fight because I'm going to be able to throw it and peg that other chimp in the head. They don't think about that beforehand. In the middle of the fight, the main thing they're using is their hands and their teeth. If in the middle of it they grab a rock, they throw it, that's for intimidation, right? If it lands, they don't pick it up and use it again. You'll notice this, right? Or if they use a weapon successfully, the other chimps don't think like, hey, I'll do that. I'll pick up some rocks. They just don't do this. They tend to just stick to what they have. They stick to their hands and their mouths. And that seems to be the same for all animals. With tools, though, it's different. With sustenance and hunting, chimps will use rocks. So chimps will actually get a hammerstone. They'll find a root, and this isn't all chimps. This is only, I think, as of 1992, they only found 2 sites where they could do this. They would get a specific hammerstone, a certain size, a certain weight. They would look for a specific, um, you know, hard surface, and they put a nut on it, and this nut has 3 compartments, so they have to hit it a certain way so that they don't destroy the nut, and they have to crack it around it. It's not easy to do. Okay, well, if they're able to use tools in this way, and also they're able to store 5 tools in the vicinity of wherever they're getting nuts. And they can also use sticks for farming for ants, termites, so they lick the stick and they stick it in. They're able to use tools. So if they're able to use tools, why don't they use tools for, like, why don't they use objects for aggression? It's almost as if, like, it's almost like their aggression map, like, doesn't even allow for that. Even though they're hunting and their sustenance and they're, like, it's not farming, it's gathering. That does have access to using objects. So for whatever reason, chimps are not able to use objects for aggression, and no other animal is either. So if you watch, like a sea otter, for example, they'll take a like a crustacean or whatever, they'll put it on their chest and they'll smash it with a rock. Okay, well, you would think that they would use that as, aggression against each other, and they don't. They're like optimized for aggression already. So something happened that allowed humans to use objects for aggression against each other. And as soon as you're able to do that, as soon as you're able to use an object for aggression against your fellow man, then you can then imagine that he's going to use it against you too. And that poses various problems, right? Okay, well, now if I'm going to go and scavenge a carcass, I don't know if somebody else is going to be there. And if there is going to be someone else there, I don't know if he's going to bring more people and if they're going to have rocks or if they're going to have sticks. So I'm going to bring a rock and a stick. But wait, he's going to know that I might bring more rocks and sticks. So he might actually bring more rocks, and he might bring bigger rocks and sharper sticks and more people. So I'm going to escalate. And there's this escalation that happens naturally when you're able to do this. And that's what makes it recursive. Right? What you're doing is you're sort of like embedding your thoughts into his thoughts, back into your thoughts, into his thoughts, blah, blah, blah. And he's doing the same thing to you. Right? So you're doing this war games, these war tactics before a move is even made. So I think, if Chomsky was looking for the first instance of using kind of recursive grammar like this, I don't think it was in vocalized language. I think it was in violence. And the only way out of that conundrum, because again, so let's say you take that tactic going to this carcass, you bring 15 people with rocks and sticks, and you end up meeting 15 people with rocks and sticks. What's going to happen? Like, you could probably hypothesize that everybody in the group might kind of be reluctant to do anything. So we have right there, everybody in that scene. I'm going to use Eric Ganz's terminology of the originary scene. Everybody in that scene has the understanding that everybody's able to use this kind of recursive object-based aggression. ROBA. That's my acronym that I came up with. Everybody in the scene is able to use ROBA. If everybody's able to use ROBA, then if one person throws a rock, then it's going to be like a Three Stooges pie fight. It's not going to be pretty. And it could be that everyone will die, including me, right? It could be that everybody gets wiped out. Now, whenever that first happened, don't know. Like, people have hypothesized that the first instance of language was 80,000 years ago with the first cave painting. But maybe it was 2.5 million years ago with the first instance of flint knapping. Maybe flint knapping was the way out of that conundrum. Maybe flint knapping was like the first way that you could pantomime violence instead of actually doing violence. And what happens then is that if you were to imagine that in order to have ROBA, in order to have recursive object-based aggression, you kind of need 2 elements combined. You need intentionality detection, which primates have, and you need object-based aggression, or even just object usage. You could say that It's just object usage combined with intentionality detection. When those two things go together, you can now predict that other people are going to start using objects for aggression because you can. For whatever reason, combining those things might have made you capable of using them for aggression, but then you immediately realize that everybody else can do that too. So that creates that recursive loop. And that recursive loop is recursion. It's like the universal grammar. And if you put object-based aggression into that, you get these war tactics, right? You could have this kind of like end game where everybody's throwing rocks at each other, and it'd be catastrophic. But if you put something else into it, if you pass, say, a gesture or a pantomimed violence, you could theoretically grammarize pantomimed violence, and that might have been the first language. We don't know. We don't know exactly what this first language was, but I find it interesting that Oldowan stone technology, which is when they start cutting rocks down to these kind of discs. And the theory is that these discs were easier to throw. Now anthropologists keep on saying that, well, the reason that they did that was for hunting. I'm not convinced that that was for hunting. I think that hunting was already optimized. I think that that the presence of ROBA required that we pass something else into the recursion module. And I think that that was flint knapping. So I don't know, maybe somebody at that scene took a rock and they went, I don't know, like, I'm going to do this to you. And then flakes came off, and then you have this kind of like culture that takes 1.5 million years. And eventually, and you have like 1.5 million years, I think, of just people making the same exact stone tools over and over and over. It's the same rock that you keep finding, this Oldowan rock. You can look it up. And then after that is a Schulian hand axes, because some of the rocks, they don't fit well. So you actually, there's some of them like they're not napped properly, but they end up with a handle, so you can grab part of it and like hack at a tree, or you can carve skin. Um, and that might have been the first language. So whatever it is, whatever was that first language, the continued use of that language instead of ROBA must have done something to us as a species. And if that's what's actually inhibiting neural crest movement, which is what happens in domestication, if you domesticate a horse, a cat, or whatever it is, neural crests well up in the brain. It impedes their movement to the extremities. Over time, that results in white paws because the paws don't get color. So the extremities start to lose color with more domestication. That might have led to white palms with people because we might have been using our hands for signing. I, Again, it's like totally conjecture, but it's interesting that the places that have less neural crest cell uh, welling are things that we use for language. So at any rate, that's what the book is about. And I've been doing a lot of research on that. I have a huge reading list. If anybody wants that list, I'll probably put a bibliography on my page pretty soon. So that's what I'm working on, and I'm really excited about it. And it's getting me going in the morning. And I really hope that you guys enjoy that when it comes out. I might do a video version of it too. The producer from Blindsided is producing this as well, and Adam McLeish. All right, I'll take a couple more questions. Let's see. This is Tomas again. He's saying, speaking of Tak Sakaguchi, his newest movie seems like a hit piece on Kenji Tanigaki's brand of action, which is funny to me as an outsider. Action guys drama. I'm curious to know why that's a hit piece on Kenji's brand of action, because Kenji's brand of action is very what would you say? It's kind of technology based. Like he's big on props. He's like a technician, right? He builds mechanisms. He's like kind of like an old school inventor. That's why I love him. Like he came up with the rubber punch, right? He puts this rubber sleeves on his hands so that you can kind of deck people. It doesn't hurt as bad. He redesigned the suits in Rurouni Kenshin so that it's got a zipper so that you can put a wire. You can like attach a wire to the harness under the suit really quickly. So he's an old school inventor. So I'm curious what Tak has in mind. Let's see what else. Tomas again. Are you still planning on your old History of Movement series? Yeah, so I have a third part of the Hong Kong movement essay written, and it's about opera. I just haven't filmed it yet, and I've been rewriting it over and over. So I've been a little bit slow for I've been a little bit slow to get that one done. And then once I'm done, I'm going to put it all together. It'll be like 1 hour. Brock says, is Kensuke Sonomura interview? Yep, that'll be coming out. Outrigger says, do you struggle working with, I guess, other martial art actors or stuntmen who aren't able to articulate themselves or their craft as well as you can? Um, I probably sound like a nut job to them. So I don't know. Most people don't really think too hard about this stuff, and they shouldn't have to. Yeah, that's all I'll say. Outrigger says, in 2001, when we see the monkey bashing the other with a stick, was that not realistic? Yeah, so there's one video that I've seen of a monkey using a stick as a weapon, and it looks totally incidental to aggression because monkeys don't bash each other with sticks. They shake branches and they shake sticks, and like in Jane Goodall's book, she talks about how they would find cans at the lab, and they'd kick these cans around, and uh, and that was a good way to kind of intimidate other chimps and get mates and whatnot. And what's interesting is that when a chimp would come up with this novel way of using cans to make a lot of noise, the other chimps didn't like copy that. They didn't think to mimic what he was doing. And certainly the females didn't. Females never really exhibited any behavior like that. The females were still brutal. They would eat each other's babies, and there's some like nasty stories in there. But in terms of actually using objects for aggression, it's just there's like very very little. There's almost nothing. The aggression mobs tend to be, hand based, and they bite. Um, and the deaths are usually days later when the victim gets infected or they get exhausted and they can't get water in time. And also just if you get beat up as a chimp, like you're an outcast. So you might just not have access to the resources that you used to have access to. Sucks to be a chimp. But there's this other interesting video too, where there's a chimp on a cliff. It's at a zoo. There's this cliff right here. And it's like 30, 40 feet down, right? And there's one chimp here on the edge of the cliff. And then these two other chimps here. And these two other chimps are just like whacking this guy. And this guy's trying to fight back, And these two are going, wah, 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 wah. And this guy goes, ah, and he'll fall. He'll almost fall. He'll do a Jackie Chan, and he'll come back. Kind of sit there for a minute. And then they'll start again. He'll fight back. He'll, wah, wah, wah. And it's like, dude, the dude never thinks to like get away from that stupid cliff. He just won't do it. Like he doesn't look back and go like, oh crap, I shouldn't be there. He just kind of stays there for like 2 or 3 minutes solid, and he'll stop, and then they'll whack at him again, and then sure enough, he falls off. It's like there's like this disconnect between aggression and environment. Um, it almost feels like animal aggression is incomplete when you see stuff like that, which is kind of a crazy thought because this implies some kind of a what would you say, like a plan for aggression, right? It implies that there's some kind of goal, genetically, evolutionarily, whatever it is, and people don't like that. But then when you look at how like the neural circuitry in a chimp, there's this in the human brain there's a what do they call it? There's a circuit that basically connects prefrontal cortex with the I'm still learning my neuroscience terminology, but basically there's this circuit that's formed that allows us to merge and create language and hierarchically nest things into other things that animals can't do. And it's due to this network that's just like it's like here somewhere. It's a circuit that's in there, right? When you look at a chimp, the network is like just almost complete, but it's not quite touching. So without that network, there's no language, right? If it's not touching, it's not touching. And we have this kind of fantasy that like, oh yeah, someday it might touch. And it's like, yeah, but they've had 5 million years to do this and they haven't, right? So it when you see that stuff, you can't help but think like, man, it's like almost there. Like you wonder if there's like a plan, and that humans we have that. It is connected, and we're totally self-destructive as a result. Like, and so the only way out of being self-destructive is language, and that language allows us to perceive the world around us, to perceive the sacred. Is that an accident? Is that just random chance? I think that people are dodging this, honestly. And I'm not saying anything right now, but I'm saying that like I think I know why people are like scientists are afraid of this idea of like of this idea of like something is like meant to be with humans. I'm just speculating. All right, I'll take one more question. Martial arts film freak. There's a video of an orangutan using a saw to cut a branch, but action was shown to them beforehand. Yeah, they can copy human tool usage, and I wouldn't put it past a chimp to use a saw for a tool. But in terms of using a saw for aggression, I don't think that's even in the same subroutine. It seems like that's like not allowed within the aggression program with chimps. Um, so this is just like I call this. This thing happened 500 years ago when Copernicus hypothesized that the Earth moves around the sun, which is a very novel idea. Well, not really. I mean, people have proposed it before, but the Copernicus is remembered for hypothesizing this because he was humble enough to admit that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, right? It's this kind of idea that Copernicus was the first sort of humble, rational skeptic, right? Which is not true. He was using the moving Earth also for astrology. He actually made astrological predictions according to his student. He didn't make any in his book, but his student wrote about how he made all these other astrological predictions based on like his new theory of the moving Earth. So now the moving Earth allowed for a new kind of astrological prediction, which is like he was an astrologer, right? It's just that he was trying to square the data with, uh, the data didn't square, right? Because in a geocentric system, all of these like secondary movements of planets, the planets are going around the Earth and they kind of do this like weird spiral thing, which means that you're reading it the wrong way. Because when you read it from the perspective of the sun being the center of the solar system, then suddenly those orbits become very regular, and that just worked better. But the the in history, like he went down the memory hole as being this like humble man who, you know, saw humans as not the center of the universe, Earth not as the center of the universe, right? And so ever since then, and probably bolstered by Darwin saying that humans are just animals, um, there's been this kind of like I would call it a religious notion that so long as you don't think that humans are special, then you can find scientific truth. And I don't think that that's panned out very well for violence. Because the more we think about human violence in terms of animal violence, it's like the further off the mark we get. I think if we can start understanding human violence as very particular and different, and human language as something very particular and different, then I think that when we start doing that, we'll actually have a better idea of like what's actually going on beneath the surface. And that's why this my theory of like the um, ROBA hypothesis is like this magma that it like underwrites all language. Right, so stuff that kind of is like underneath all language. Now, some language is just sitting right above it, right? Shouting matches, fist fights, things like that, right? Like you're kind of like bordering on falling into Roba, but you're kind of held together with language, making sure that people don't break rules, and there's like community enforcement and all this, right? And then a higher up from that is, sanctioned martial arts with gloves and whatnot, and then above that is sports, and then you just get like Oxford debates, and then the uh, World Economic Forum, right? And so like all language is just like it's just built on some like level of some kind of structure above ROBA because ROBA underwrites all of it nonetheless. So there's always ROBA like underneath all of it. The question is just like how do you keep producing language so that ROBA doesn't erupt up like a volcano? Um, and this keeps baffling people when they create these like world government institutions, and then you have World War II, right? They make Esperanto. It's like, well, we should be able to all get along. Let's make a new language, and you have World War II, right? We beat World War II. We destroyed all evil. Let's join with USSR and like take over the entire world and make sure that there's no more fighting. Then we have the Cold War. Like it just never goes away. There's always this stuff like erupting up, with whatever it's going to be, riots and terror attacks, and so we just don't understand it very well because we keep on calling ourselves animals. Um, all right, last question I'll take. Martial arts film freak. Do you think the first fight was based on "I want what you have"? The first human fight? I don't know. I think the first human fight would have been something like, "I'm going to try and kill you before you kill me." I think that would have been the first human fight. I think that was the Cain and Abel story. Um, and I think that that story has a lot of truth to it because there had to have been a first murder. There had to have been. Most likely would have been with a rock. Um, but I think that the Cain and Abel story is written during the Iron Age. I don't think that comes from the Stone Age because it's when you have the threat of apocalyptic violence. I think that that only comes when you have the Iron Age. I think it takes a long time to get to apocalyptic violence. Anyway, that's for a different discussion. All right, that was fun, y'all. I'm gonna try and get an episode up by Thursday. If not, this one will have to suffice. Thank you all for your time, and